The election season in Australia has started when the cash handouts and the pork barrelling start. And so it has with Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party. They've gone about doing cash handouts to people with HECS debts, promising to wipe off 20% of those debts, summing up to about $16 billion over the forward estimates. And the one-off surplus wasn't even enough to cover the cost of Anthony Albanese and ALP's promises. Now, of course, the ALP has gone around saying that they are giving students money, that either Anthony Albanese or Jim Chalmers or Jason Clare have given people money. The ALP has given students money. But in reality, it is not the ALP that is giving people money. It is obviously the taxpayer. Because when something is supposedly free in inverted commas, obviously it means that someone else is paying. And here, that someone else is taxpayers. People are paying for this student debt wipe-off. Now, it's clear that this is just an attempt to secure seats in the upcoming election. The Labor Party is concerned that the Greens might take votes from them amongst the younger demographic, even though the Greens did rather badly in the Queensland election. Nevertheless, the ALP is trying to secure that section of the demographic. Whether it works, we don't really know. Whether people's votes can be bought in this manner, it isn't entirely clear. After all, there's quite a lot of younger people who have perhaps gotten a job after going into university and then have started to pay off their debt. Perhaps they saved a lot to pay it off all at once. They're not going to get any benefit of this because it is not retrospective. People aren't going to get credit for having paid early. Similarly, people who never went to university get nothing out of this. People who never went to university are then implicitly paying for other people's university education. To which the university graduates might retort that they, of course, would be paying for those other people's various things, whatever those might be, whether it's free TAFE or whatever the case might be, or whether it's subsidized apprenticeships. In essence, someone is ultimately paying for this, and the person paying for it is not the person receiving the benefit. That, however, is an inherent problem in all government spending, because generally the person receiving the government spending is not the one who is ultimately paying for that government spending. That's inherently how government works. This is not really any different, but it does of course look a little bit bad. Now, there's been arguments that this is somehow regressive. I'm less concerned about that, i.e. if someone is perhaps going to university and then they do end up with a very high paying job, that person is ultimately going to be paying very high taxes, and therefore them getting a benefit now is somewhat front-loading the very few benefits they might ultimately end up getting. So I'm less concerned about the regressive aspect of it, but I am concerned about the bad incentives it sets, because it basically says to students, why pay off your student debt? Just wait for a government handout. The government is going to wipe off your debt. It creates a bad debts problem. It means that the government is not getting the money in as early as would be ideal. And any bank will tell you that getting the money back early is generally good because it de-risks you. The government doesn't seem to realize this. Not only that, the government has foolishly removed any discounts that you would ever have gotten for paying upfront or paying early. There used to be discounts for paying early, now those have gone. They went by the wayside in the name of supposed equity. They went by the wayside because there was a claim that only wealthier people could pay upfront. Now that may be true. However, from a fiscal and financial balancement perspective, it is better to get the money early rather than late. You want to incentivize people to pay it early rather than later. Otherwise, no one is going to pay it early because it would not be rational. The government doesn't seem to actually be thinking logically about the student debt situation. Now, of course, it could be much worse. The government could have just completely written off student debt. That would have been a much worse situation, but still, it's not great policy. And the government has been rightly called out for it. Now, of course, there are some issues with university degrees that are useless or not leading to good quality jobs. That is a separate issue, however, from the HECS debt situation. That's a separate issue with the quality of student education. It's a separate issue in terms of ensuring that universities are focusing on the degrees that lead to good jobs rather than degrees that either don't lead to good jobs or worse, lead to people advocating for more government intervention and more government spending at the expense of other people who did not do those otherwise useless degrees. So ultimately, cutting some of those degrees might in fact be beneficial, but that, like I've said, is a separate issue. Now, of course, this hasn't stopped some vice-chancellors from suggesting the government should make education free for all. George Williams, for example, seems to assert that university education should be even cheaper, subsidized even more by, quote, the government, which inherently means the taxpayer. Now, for a vice-chancellor to say this, on the one hand, it is relatively unsurprising. More government money to universities is probably what they would want. However, on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be very forward-thinking. The reason for that is as soon as you become so tied to the government, then you become a cost center for the government and you become more and more costly over time. And it means as a university, your implicit fees from the government for teaching students are not going to go up properly. They're going to be capped. And as a result, the universities are going to end up in more and more financial problems. We've seen this by parity of reasoning with legal aid in the Northern Territory, which, because funding hasn't gone up, has been unable to take on new cases. The same would apply to universities. But of course, when a vice-chancellor is only really there for a few years, that long-term ramification doesn't really catch up with them. And I'll also note that many vice-chancellors don't have a ton of economic or accounting or finance knowledge. In the case of George Williams, he's come from a constitutional law background and he's most known for the Voice referendum campaign. So I'm not entirely convinced by his financial reasoning there. But of course, the University of Melbourne also made a similar argument. But I would note that from both the university's perspective and the taxpayer's perspective, university education being, quote, free is not going to be good. The taxpayers ultimately will lose out because they'll be spending more money, and also that money will go into various wasteful degrees over which there is relatively little market discipline. Because if the money is just coming from heaven for these universities, then they can spend it however they want, and they don't have the discipline of needing to manage their books effectively. Now, of course, at the moment, universities are facing some budgetary problems. That again is a slightly separate issue. Universities may have some legitimate concerns. Some of the concerns might be due to mismanagement and excessive expenses. But we have seen some layoffs going on. For example, the University of Wollongong recently laid off over 100 people or is looking to do so. And it looks like professional staff from the university are likely to be going in 2025. Universities are, of course, facing issues with caps on international students. And this ultimately would have a follow-on effect to domestic students. After all, if the money from international students isn't coming through to subsidize domestic students' education, then domestic students' education would worsen. And the reason for that is universities simply wouldn't be able to afford as many academics or as highly qualified academics to teach people. The highly qualified academics, if for example their pay is cut, could simply go to the United States, or for those who have relationships with business and the like, or with pharmaceutical companies if they're in medicine, or they're actually working doctors if they are doctors in the medical faculties, well, they could just go into the private sector entirely and skip the universities. So you'd end up actually losing, ironically, the people you probably actually want to keep who have practical skills. But in any case, circling back around to the student debt write-off, it is clearly just pork barreling for the election. It's clearly trying to buy votes. It is not good policy, but worse than that, the government is pretending that they, the government, the ALP, Anthony Albanese, are giving people money. That is disingenuous and is disrespectful to the taxpayer. The money is not the ALP's. The money is not Anthony Albanese's. The money is not Jim Chalmers. The money is the taxpayers. They are taking money from taxpayers to give out this $16 billion, which I'll note is nearly double the surplus that they somehow managed to get through tax hikes, i.e. backward keep, and commodity prices in the latest year, and which is forecast to reverse into deficit. But let me know your thoughts about this handout in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.